welcome everybody. I'm Dan Winslow with the New England Legal Foundation. This is the latest in our Economic Liberty Speaker Series. We're honored today to have Jason Crawford to talk about a new vision of progress. Jason is recognized as a leading thinker in the progress movement. He started writing about progress in 2017. He's written for the MIT Technology Review. He's been interviewed as a spokesperson for the movement by the BBC and Vox. He's given guest lectures at MIT and here. He's also more than 19,000 followers on his newsletter, over 33,000 Twitter followers, and he was named one of the Future Perfect 50 by Vox, along with some other very distinguished people. He's currently writing a book, The Grand Challenge. I'm hoping to get some insights and previews of some of the thinking of that book, an historical narrative dramatizing progress as a story of problems and solutions, showing how difficult life used to be and how technology and industry have come to the rescue and will come to the rescue still. It makes the case for progress standing in opposition to pessimism and degrowth and lays the foundation for a new philosophy of progress, a progress philosophy we so desperately need. And without further ado, Jason Crawford.
Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody who showed up. Thank you to everybody who's on the Zoom. Very glad to be able to address this group on a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. So let's dive in. 50,000 years ago, our ancestors lived at the mercy of nature. They had no agriculture. They had to hunt and forage for their food. A campfire was their only source of light and warmth. They had language, but no writing. So any knowledge they wanted to preserve or pass down to the generations had to be, transmitted through an oral tradition or perhaps in pictures. If we fast forward to just a few hundred years ago, civilization had come a very long way. Right? We had agriculture, for instance. We had cities. We had governments. And yet most people still lived in what today we would consider to be extreme poverty, their lives full of backbreaking manual labor. They would have graduated from campfires perhaps to candles for light, but not sweet-smelling beeswax candles like we might use today. They would probably be made of tallow, animal fat, and even those were somewhat expensive. Disease was rampant. Both endemic and epidemic disease, and plagues would sweep through cities, decimating the population. Today, of course, we've come a very long way. We live and work in gleaming towers of steel and glass. We zip around on the land and in the air, in cars and airplanes. We relax at home in the evenings with streaming music and video, or perhaps catch up with friends around the world in live, face-to-face video conversations. By the numbers, per capita incomes have increased some 20 to 30 times in industrialized nations compared to their pre-industrial levels. And life expectancy at birth has more than doubled as a worldwide average. So the worldwide average in 1800 was under 30 years of life expectancy at birth, and today it's over 70. You can see that has increased dramatically in all regions of the world. And yet, not everyone is happy about this world that we've created. A few years ago, there was this editorial that ran in The Atlantic under the title, "Is Progress Good for Humanity?" with progress in scare quotes, like so-called progress. Jared Diamond, the historian who wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel, once wrote an article calling agriculture the worst mistake in the history of the human race. Agriculture, which brought us out of that hunter-gatherer society and allowed us to have settled society, and literally the foundation for everything else that has happened since. Maybe he says that was a mistake. Economic growth is variously referred to as an addiction, a fetish, a Ponzi scheme, or even my favorite, a fairy tale. There is even now an entire degrowth movement advocating for economic regress rather than progress as the ideal that we should aspire to, of course, in the name of sustainability. A snail has become their mascot, indicating the pace at which they would like to see things move. So what happened to the idea of progress? The first thing to understand is that the very idea of progress is a modern notion. Through most of history, in most places and times, people did not think about or believe in progress. In fact, many ancient and medieval peoples had a cyclical sort of notion of history, that it was just ups and downs, back and forth, or even a declinist idea that the past was a golden age from which we have fallen and perhaps will continue to fall. You can imagine in medieval Europe, after the fall of the Roman Empire, 1,000 years later, people looking back on the ruins of things like the Colosseum in Rome and even the pyramids, thinking that, wow, those ancient ancestors of ours must have been a race of moral and intellectual giants. They must have been so much better than us, and they must have known so much more. In fact, there was an idea that perhaps all knowledge of consequence was revealed to people in ancient times, and that there was nothing we could do, no way that we could surpass them or learn anything that they didn't know, and that all we could do was to study the ancient texts and try to wring deeper and deeper levels of meaning out of them through more and more exegesis, just trying to even approach what they used to know, the ancient wisdom. Now, the first cracks in this view of the world appeared around the time of the voyages of discovery in the 15th century, when an entire continent or two appeared that was never mentioned in any of the ancient writings. Well, perhaps not all knowledge that mattered was revealed in ancient times. The ancients also didn't know about the compass, about gunpowder, or about the printing press. And Francis Bacon, for one, looked at these developments and said, essentially, maybe there's a lot more stuff out there like this that has not yet been discovered. Noble inventions, he said, may be lying at our very feet. This is in his famous work, Novum Organum, or the New Organon, New Method, published in the early 1600s. And he pointed out that, yes, some of these things like gunpowder or silk or the magnet, maybe they depend on kind of like some sort of material properties that are unusual, that were easy to not discover. But the printing press is just a simple mechanical invention. There is, quote, nothing in the art of printing which is not plain and obvious. Now, for Bacon, this was not a, forehead slapping moment like, hey, how dumb we are to not think of this. It was an inspiring moment. It was, think about how much more could be out there if we just go and look for it, and look for it very carefully. And Bacon's view was that the goal of science was to endow human life with, quote, new discoveries and powers. So knowledge was for use and for application in industry and the arts. Now, if there's any doubt about the ancients versus the moderns and whether progress was possible, it was laid to rest by Isaac Newton and his theory of gravitation and theory of the solar system. This was clearly something that made much more sense, explained much more, was far superior to anything that the ancients had come up with, not Aristotle, not Ptolemy. Newton's system was the thing. So progress was clearly possible after the end of the 1600s. The climax of this optimism, perhaps, was with the French Enlightenment thinker, the Marquis de Condorcet, who, towards the end of the 1700s, wrote a book, Sketch for a Historical Picture of the Progress of the Human Mind, in which he forecast, virtually unlimited progress in every dimension, not only scientific and technological, but moral and social. He foresaw the equality of the sexes and races, and an end to war and slavery. And he thought that all of these things, in fact, went together, that prosperity would, quote, naturally dispose men to humanity, to benevolence, and to justice. He thought that the moral goodness of man was susceptible of an indefinite improvement, and that nature has connected by a chain which cannot be broken, truth, happiness, and virtue. It is all the more remarkable that he wrote this while he was hiding out from the French Revolution, who was hunting him down in order to execute him because he had dared to criticize the Constitution of 1793. Truly, his optimism for humanity knew no bounds. Unfortunately for Condorcet, he could not hide out forever. He was soon captured and died in jail awaiting the guillotine. Evidently, the moral perfection of mankind was slow in coming. But technological progress was racing ahead. The century that followed saw an amazing set of inventions that transformed the world. The railroad, the telephone and telegraph, the electric light bulb, generator, and motor. Inventors like Thomas Edison were hailed as national heroes. And indeed, some writers began to realize that they should be paying more attention to this phenomenon that was going on. So Samuel Smiles, who basically invented the genre of industrial biography, and incidentally, the genre of self-help, quoted a friend of his, a quote, distinguished living mechanic, as saying that kings, warriors, and statesmen have heretofore monopolized not only the pages of history, but almost those of biology, or biography, rather. Surely some niche ought to be found for the mechanic, that is what we would call an engineer or an inventor. There is a heroism of skill and toil belonging to them, worthy of as grateful record. Less perilous and romantic it may be than that of the other, that is the kings and warriors, but not less full of the results of human energy, bravery, and character. So by the late 1800s or mid 1800s, people were starting to see that even invention and science took energy, bravery, and character. When the Brooklyn Bridge was completed, again towards the end of the 1800s, it was called a wonder of science, an astounding exhibition of the power of man to change the face of nature, a monument to enterprise, skill, faith, endurance, to public spirit, the moral qualities of the human soul, a symbol of peace. Towards the end of the 1800s, Alfred Russel Wallace, who's better known for his work on evolution with Darwin, wrote a book called The Wonderful Century, in which he looked back on the great achievements and discoveries of the century of the 1800s and counted up 24 of them, as opposed to only 15 for all of human history up until the beginning of the century. It really seemed like amazing things were going on. At the beginning of the 20th century, the New York World on January 1st, 1901, called themselves optimistic enough to believe that the 20th century will meet and overcome all perils and prove to be the best this steadily improving planet has ever seen. They hadn't seen anything yet. Just a few years later, a man would fly. So it seemed that the optimism of the Enlightenment had been justified. And if the scientific and technological progress that had been prophesied by Francis Bacon could come true, well, maybe the moral and social progress prophesied by Condorcet could come true as well. It seemed plausible after all. Just in the last century or two, we had seen the beginning of the end of monarchy, the replacement of it with a republican form of government with democratically elected representatives. The slavery had been ended in the West. And new inventions like the telegraph were promising to bring far-flung peoples together. So this is an illustration that was done after the first telegraph cable was laid across the Atlantic Ocean in the mid-1800s. Yes, they did that, a transatlantic telegraph cable with 1800s technology. And this sort of allegorical drawing was done. So this represents a Yankee on the left and a Englishman on the right shaking hands across the ocean, because now you talk to each other powered by electricity. You see the lightning bolts in the background. Those two ships in the background are the ones that laid the cable across. And so it was really seen. Now remember, just about 50 years earlier, these countries were fighting a war. And so now the telegraph is bringing them together. And people were super optimistic about this. At a dinner in honor of Samuel Morse, who's one of the inventors of telegraph technology, somebody said that because of the telegraph, the different nations and races of men will know one another better, be moved by common sympathies, swayed by common interests. The electric spark is the true Promethean fire, which is to kindle human hearts. Men will learn they are brethren, and it is not less their interest than their duty to cultivate goodwill and peace throughout the earth. This was the moral benefit that people saw to inventions like the telegraph. The most optimistic thinkers of the late 19th century hoped and predicted that because of the growth of industry and prosperity, the expansion of trade between nations, and these new communication inventions like the telegraph, that all of this was going to lead to a new era of world peace, an end to war. Of course, they were wrong. The world wars of the 20th century violently shattered those naive illusions. Technology had not led to an end to war. In fact, it had given us the machine gun, chemical weapons, and of course, the atomic bomb, the most horrible and destructive weapon the world had ever seen. Obviously, the product of modern science, modern technology, and modern industrial capacity. And it wasn't just the wars. There was a depression, worldwide. There was the rise of totalitarianism around the globe. It was becoming harder and harder to believe in the old, liberal idea of, the rationality of humanity and the predictability and controllability of nature. That Enlightenment idea was being thrown into question. Indeed, as early as the 1930s, this is even before World War II, historians were saying that the fact of progress is disputed and the doctrine discredited, and asking, may we still, in whatever different fashion, believe in the progress of mankind? What had gone wrong? How had the world reached such a state, just when everything seemed to be going so well? Progress had always had its critics. As early as the mid-1700s, Rousseau was saying that, quote, our souls have become corrupted to the extent that our sciences and our arts have advanced towards perfection. This is even before the Industrial Revolution. And already Rousseau is starting to say that moral and social progress are inversely correlated to scientific and technological progress. Now, voices like Rousseau's, I think, were in the background, were a minority for a long time, particularly through the 19th century. Those voices could not be heard above all the cheering for the new inventions, for the railroad, for the light bulb, and everything. But in the 20th century, a set of challenges to the idea of progress came to the fore and made people revisit some of those more reactionary ideas. So let's review what those are. What were the challenges that made people question progress? Some of them were old and went back centuries. For instance, technological unemployment is a very old concern. As early as the 1600s, there are records of machine breaking in the textile industry. It's particularly a deal in the textile industry because it was one of the earliest industries to be automated. And people would smash machines, the workers would come in with hammers, they would burn them, they would threaten the factory owners. Pollution. When sewage was being dumped in the Thames River. This illustration was a political cartoon, was put in the newspapers. This is the Thames River introducing his offspring to London. Now the Thames is depicted as this horrible, dirty monster, and the offspring are diseases, diphtheria, scrofula, cholera, that the river was bringing to London because of all the filth. Air pollution as well. Both London and Pittsburgh were at various times likened to hell on earth because of the black clouds of smoke from coal burning that would cloud the sky. Andrew Carnegie, surely no enemy of industry, said in his autobiography that Pittsburgh in the 19th century, the smoke permeated and penetrated everything. If you placed your hand on the balustrade, it came away black. If you washed face and hands, they were as dirty as ever in an hour. The soot gathered in the hair and irritated the skin, and after I returned from the mountains, life was more or less miserable. That was just the reality of the time. And even as Carnegie and Rockefeller and Morgan and others were amassing fortunes, many were still living at this time in squalor, in tenement houses, very crowded, packed multiple people to a room, no indoor plumbing, no electricity, little ventilation. Oh, and by the way, all that coal that we were burning was a limited resource, which people were worried was going to run out. In the 1800s, this William Stanley Jevons wrote The Coal Question, and he was worried about England running out of coal. He said this was the basis for England's might, but it was going to run out, and that would be bad news for England. These were all old problems prior to the 20th century, but the 20th century itself brought new ones. Industrial food production, for instance, meat packing plants, right? So once people were getting their food from distant sources that had to be transported and were processed in, industrial plants and so forth, the meat packing plants were filthy. The conditions were terrible. You don't even want to read about them. It was really disgusting. Milk was transported warm in open containers, a literal breeding ground for bacteria. And if you did catch something, by the way, the medicines that you might have bought around that time from the patent medicine industry might have been worse than the disease. The patent medicine industry was in the 1890s, early 20th century was full of scams and fraud, things that at best were useless and at worst might actively harm you. There were new hazards from new technologies like X-rays, which at first were thought to be completely harmless. After all, you could neither see nor hear nor feel them nor detect them in any way except with special equipment. How could such a thing possibly harm you? And yet X-ray technicians were starting to get X-ray dermatitis, and if people found out it could irritate the skin, lose hair. Eventually they realized it gives you cancer. So these new technologies had new hazards. What people were learning the hard way was a truth that progress is messy. It has costs and risks, and we have to figure out how to deal with them. But what do we make of this? Is this an indictment of progress? Do we keep moving forward? Well, history doesn't interpret itself. It relies on, or we rely on, historians, philosophers, and other intellectuals to interpret history, to look at the facts, to try to sum them up, to make sense of them. To diagnose our problems and prescribe solutions. And in the 20th century, some intellectuals were stepping forward to suggest that maybe progress itself is the problem, that modernity was a mistake. The radical environmentalist movement, for instance, with writers like William Vogt, Rachel Carson, Paul Ehrlich with his Population Bomb book in the 1960s. We're talking about the limits to growth and how all of this economic activity was harming the planet and ultimately harming humanity. There was a countercultural movement that was suspicious of all large systems of organized human activity, really whatsoever. Didn't matter if it was government, science, industry, all of it, Lewis Mumford said, was a mega machine that was beyond the control of any human, was squashing individuals, limiting autonomy, was a threat to freedom. In the 1960s, this fused into a radical social movement marked by a deep distrust of technology and of industry. And this soon made its way into law and policy. In 1971, soon after a few environmental laws were passed, particularly NEPA, a court decision about NEPA, one of the first ones, said in the preamble that these cases are only the beginning of what promises to become a flood of new litigation. Correct prophecy. Seeking judicial assistance in protecting the environment, several recently enacted statutes attest to the commitment of government to control at long last the destructive engine of material progress, with progress, once again, in scare quotes, so-called progress. So when material progress becomes seen as a destructive engine, then social forces rally to slow it and stop it. By the 1990s, writers about progress were asking, basically, how does anybody still believe in this thing? How does it happen, says Christopher Lasch, that serious people continue to believe in progress in the face of massive evidence that might have been expected to refute the idea of progress once and for all? What have been the consequences? Well, the direct causality is hard to prove, but I think it is no coincidence that over the last several decades, there's been a long-term downward trend in GDP growth, per capita GDP growth in this country, our sort of best proxy for wealth and production. Now, some industries certainly have raced ahead, particularly computers and technology, arguably genetic engineering, but others have fallen behind, like construction, manufacturing, transportation, energy, have all slowed down. Nuclear power was stunted, the Concorde was grounded, the Apollo program was canceled, and those flying cars that we were promised never arrived. Today, we cannot even build enough housing to meet demand. And I'm pretty sure that from a technical standpoint, purely technical standpoint, building housing is a solved problem. It is not a technical problem, it is a social and legal problem. Well, if you're with me so far, what can we do? Well, I don't think we can go back to the 19th century philosophy of progress. I think that was naive in some important ways. And yet, the 20th century turn towards pessimism, fatalism, defeatism, I think, was a mistake. It was the wrong diagnosis, the wrong prescription, and has done more harm than good. We need a new philosophy of progress for the 21st century and beyond. Based on a recognition of the fact and reality of progress, we need to revive, this idea that progress is real and important. Based on a deep humanism, understanding human well-being to be the ultimate standard and goal of all of this progress, and a deep sense of human agency, both at the individual level and at the social level, that we have the ability to confront problems, to solve them, and that both, as individuals and as a society, we can be trusted to make choices and to ultimately shape our future. At the same time, we need to avoid the mistakes of the past. Progress is not inevitable or automatic, as some in the 18th and 19th century thought that it was. It depends on choice and effort. It is contingent. It is up to us. Progress has costs and risks, which must be grappled with and dealt with. They are problems to be solved. And this means that safety needs to be a part of progress. We need to think of it as a first-class citizen as one of the goals, not the only goal, but one of the goals that we are optimizing for, and one of the achievements, truly, of progress. We need to recognize that moral progress and technological progress do not always go together. They do not move in lockstep. And technology in the context of an evil social system can just be used for war and oppression and other evils. Above all, I think we need to regain a bold, ambitious vision of the future, the technological future that we want to live in and are inspired to build. A future where we cure aging and disease. One where we invent fusion energy and nanotechnology, where we have clean, abundant, reliable energy for all the things we want to do. Where we go back to space and develop a space economy and maybe even terraform other planets, settle the solar system and eventually the galaxy. To establish a philosophy of progress, to build a culture of progress, we need a progress movement. Ideas of progress need to be everywhere. They should be taught in schools. It should be in the media, in journalism, new media and old media. It should be in art and entertainment. We need major Hollywood biopics of scientists and inventors that actually dramatize the process of creation and discovery. We need sci-fi that shows us a future we actually want to live in, not just an endless series of dystopias. And most of all, we need books. The foundation for any movement, any intellectual movement is books. Even though only a minority of people read them, they are ultimately influential on the entire world. There's already a few great ones out there about progress. These are just a couple of my favorites. But we need shelves and shelves full of books. You can walk into any library or bookstore today and find shelves and shelves full of books on environmental studies, on religious studies, on gender studies, on any kind of studies. We need just as many books about progress studies. There should be more than you could ever have time to read in a lifetime. So this is my mission, both for my organization, my career, and what I've made really the mission of my life. Several years ago, I started writing what was then a small blog called The Roots of Progress, where I began exploring these topics. As was mentioned, it's now almost 20,000 subscribers. And on top of the success of the blog, we have also turned this into a nonprofit. Last year, we launched the first cohort of our fellowship, supporting progress writers. We had about 20 talented up-and-coming progress writers join the cohort and get instruction in writing and building an audience and connection to mentors and a network. We're going to run another cohort of that this year. But it's not just me. I'm not alone in this movement. A few years ago in The Atlantic, a great article came out by Tyler Cowen, economist at George Mason University, Mercatus Center, and also co-authored by Patrick Collison, co-founder of a very successful technology company called Stripe. And it ran under the headline, "We Need a New Science of Progress." And in this, they coined the term progress studies and called for a new discipline. And this article galvanized a movement. A number of writers, journalists, bloggers, other intellectuals, policy folks, researchers came together, looked at each other, reacting to this article and said, "Oh, wow, this idea resonates with all of us. Let's get together, let's talk more." A community was formed. Now there are a number of different efforts. The Atlantic itself has launched a progress initiative. Derek Thompson is one of the staff writers there who's been doing a lot to drive this and writing a lot about it. He's also working on a book about progress. There's a new online journal called Works in Progress that features really high quality writing on a broad variety of topics. There is humanprogress.org. This is actually a project that's been around for more than a decade now, and they've got a bunch of really good articles. They are now turning them into books as well. They've got a whole bank of data that you can look into on the history of progress. There is even a DC policy think tank, the Institute for Progress, that just launched a couple of years ago that is doing what they can at the federal policy level to advance these ideas and to unblock progress. So this movement is underway. I invite you all to join us, learn about the history and the theory of progress, learn what are blocking things today and what we can do about it, learn more about these organizations, sign up, tune in, get involved, and we would love to have you.
Thank you, Jason. Would you mind taking some questions from the audience?
Absolutely, yes.
So if you have any questions, just raise your hand or you can put it in the chat. Elizabeth Miner is our manager of membership and events here at Bell. Thank you, Elizabeth, for all your work on getting this event organized today. So feel free to just put a question in the chat or raise your hand and Elizabeth will call you out. I just have a question, Jason, just on fundamentals.
Please.
What's the website? I didn't mention the website for Roots of Progress.
Yes, rootsofprogress.org.
That's easy.
Simple as can be.
That's fantastic. And what do you see as the greatest impediment to progress from this point going forward? The retrospective was great. It's actually great to see that there was pressure against progress going back hundreds of years. But going forward, what are the greatest impediments to progress from this point forward? Yeah, I mean, there have been, there has been opposition to progress in all ages and times. I think it's important to know that even at the height
when people were most enthusiastic about progress, every new invention would still be met with skeptics and opponents. And obviously there were always entrenched interests who felt threatened. Today, I see three major challenges to progress. I think there's three big things we need to do. One is the growth of the regulatory state. It's become very difficult to build anything in this country. We can't build infrastructure, we can't build housing, we can't build transit, we can't even build power plants, we can't even build clean energy, the thing that everybody says that they want. We can't build the transmission lines that would get the clean energy to people. And a lot of that is because permitting and NEPA is a big part of it. It's not the only part. And so we need permitting reform. We need a YIMBY movement. And it's broader than just permitting. I mean,
YIMBY, yes, in my backyard.
That's right.
I mean,
yeah, as in opposition to NIMBY, right? The NIMBYs. It's not just permitting reform. Supersonic travel is banned over land in the US. It is illegal to fly supersonic from New York to LA. So hopefully that will get reversed. The SEC has been making it very difficult to innovate in cryptocurrencies, in prediction markets, and things like that. The FDA has imposed a huge cost on new drugs and pharmaceutical innovation. So there's a lot of these things which, even if you can understand some of the basis for it and why it came about, it has overgrown and gone too far. That's number one. Number two, I'll be briefer with the others. So number two is the centralization and bureaucratization of funding for science and research. Science funding today is centralized really in a few massive government agencies. Biggest is the NIH, which is over $40 billion. NSF, I think, now is over 10 billion. DARPA is, another few billion. And a lot of good work getting funded, but I think any kind of centralized funding by that very nature is problematic for a discipline where by the nature of science, we need people who are questioning the status quo, breaking old paradigms, and so there's a whole, it's a whole sort of set of things under that. And then the last thing is what I focused on in this talk, which is the culture of progress, and bringing back a sense of agency, a sense that there is, that a bright future is possible if we work for it, and bringing back moral and social status to scientists, engineers, and founders. I think folks who work in those fields should really feel as if their work has moral meaning and should see themselves as part of a noble quest, part of the grand project of humanity to advance human progress. And instead, they are very, very often painted as the villains.
So I have a couple of questions from the chat.
Please.
Tim Wessels asks, no talk of living in an ecological system that is being destroyed by industrial civilization. What do we do when we no longer have a planet we can live on?
Yeah. I simply don't buy the narrative that we are destroying the ecological system. There is certainly some damage that is done in certain places and times. Pollution is very real. We've made a lot of progress against pollution. I really recommend a site, by the way, if you want to know the facts of how things have evolved. Our World in Data is a very excellent site. I guess I should disclose that I have in the past done some contracting with them, although not recently. But just it's an excellent collection of the facts. Very neutral and unbiased. They are not selling a story of how everything's great. They will show you the ways in which certain things are getting worse. But it turns out most things are getting better if you just sample kind of, and you can look up pollution and what's happened. And, certainly in, maybe pollution is still bad in Beijing, but in a lot of places, air pollution has come way down. We actually have a cleaner environment than we did, decades ago. Climate change is a challenge, but it is one that I believe we can meet, and I don't think we need degrowth in order to do it. I think through a combination of clean energy, carbon capture, and solar radiation management, it is a problem to be solved.
And just to add to what you said a moment ago, a lot of this is self-inflicted, this challenge, because for the climate, as an example, power generation, power transmission, power utilization, much of this is impeded in terms of progress by a regulatory state that simply will not allow things to happen to solve the problem.
Yeah. If we can't build anything, if we can't move, if we can't implement solutions, then of course we're not going to solve our problems.
Right. And when I hear that things are an existential threat to humanity, maybe it's time we get serious about getting out of our own way and solving them. Other
Yeah,
questions?
and climate change, by the way, is a huge potential problem, but it's not an existential threat to humanity. I mean, if you read the IPCC reports, the actual scientific reports, and what they estimate, they are not talking about human doom. They're not talking about human extinction. They're not talking about an unlivable planet. They're talking about $1 trillion or more in economic damage. Now that's huge, but remember, world GDP is $100 trillion. So even if it's a huge hit, I hope it's something that we can avoid and mitigate. But it's not a threat to the species. It's not, and unfortunately, it's been sold that way. And young people today, many of them literally believe that they don't have a future, that humanity is going to be gone before they're finished, with their natural lives. And there's just simply no scientific reason to believe that.
This next question comes in from Omar Shihata. One thing I've struggled with talking to degrowth folks is there are many problems we need to solve for progress to work. They say progress is good and all, but it seems unsustainable. Do you feel that we have a sense of urgency for progress, that we need not to just support progress, but invest very heavily and quickly enough to transition to clean energy, to scale up EVs and batteries, etc.?
I do not think that we have a sense of urgency, the proper sense of urgency in the mainstream at large. I think the progress community and those adjacent to it have that sense of urgency and have been trying to sound the alarm. There's a lot of good writers out there who have been especially talking about the energy transition and about the need to be able to build infrastructure. I pointed to some folks at the Institute for Progress. You can check out their writing. A few other journalists who write about this type of stuff. I mentioned Derek Thompson at The Atlantic. Jerusalem Dempsis at The Atlantic is also very good. Noah Smith at Bloomberg, Matt Iglesias, who has his own Substack now, even Ezra Klein at the New York Times, who's coined the term, quote, supply side progressivism. So even some who style themselves as progressives are starting to see, whoa, we need to build, we need economic growth and progress to achieve any of our goals here. So, but those voices are still a minority, and I think it hasn't quite reached the mainstream yet, and that's why we need to keep pushing and growing this movement.
I actually wanted to ask about the terms progressivism and conservatism and how they play into the progress that you're talking about. Because in some cultures, especially in conservative cultures, progressivism has become a dirty word and has been changed to think about, different ideas that are not about human innovation. They're maybe about redefinition of humanity, but not necessarily about progress in a capitalistic market. That seems more of a conservative thought process to be able to allow the markets to be free and do their thing and innovate. So when you use the term progress, do you run into those kinds of challenges where some cultures are like, progress is bad, or, progressivism has been manipulated, and do you have to re-explain that to people, how we can bring it back?
Yeah, occasionally there is confusion between the term progress and the term progressive. They're just very different things at this point. Steven Pinker, who wrote this book Enlightenment Now, which was really about progress, he had this quip. He opened one of the chapters. He said, "Intellectuals hate progress, and intellectuals who style themselves as progressive really hate progress." So unfortunately, it's true. It's funny so the progressive movement of the late 19th century, early 20th century was did actually care about progress. It was, however, a very technocratic movement. It was a movement that really felt that everything ought to be run pretty much top down by educated elites. Everything ought to be scientifically managed, that not only the government, but all of our natural resources, the whole economy eventually. This is really what the New Deal was about, right? In a sense, communism in Soviet Russia was kind of the ultimate expression of this. The communists, by the way, so today's communists maybe have a lot of sympathy with degrowthers and are not all about economic growth. But the communists of the 1920s and 30s and for decades after, they really cared about economic growth. So the Soviets, they actually adored America in the 20s. because we had Henry Ford. They loved Henry Ford, by the way. Lenin and Stalin, they loved Ford. They bought a lot of plants and equipment and everything. They wanted to copy American production, and they thought that they would do it better. In fact, everybody on both sides of the ocean, everybody thought or was worried that communism was going to be more productive, richer, wealthier, advance faster. Some people actually thought that electricity could never be built out on a capitalist foundation because capitalism is messy. It's so we need more rational top-down system and organization, and this chaotic capitalist system is never going to work. So everybody thought the communists were going to zip ahead. Of course, that's not what happened. Capitalism turns out to be the better system for economic growth and progress. And so what happened was along the way of the 20th century, I think the progressives and the socialists and so forth, they kind of dropped the focus on economic growth and production. And a part of that, I suspect, was because they were being influenced by this growing counterculture and environmentalist movement. This is the difference between the old left and the new left, if you've heard those terms, right? So the old left was very much focused on production. The new left was much more influenced by this counterculture and environmentalism and was not so interested in production. And so they kept their social goals and social vision and dropped the economic and scientific and technological. So that's where we are today. I keep using the term progress because I think it's just an important concept. And because it's a term that a bunch of different thinkers all converged on. I mentioned Tyler Cowen and Patrick Collison. I mentioned Steven Pinker. There was me, Johan Norberg. A bunch of us had all used this term before there was even a progress movement. So I keep using it. But occasionally I have to distinguish, this is not progressive. Personally, I think there's a healthy balance between progressivism in maybe the philosophical sense of always wanting to move forward, to discard the old and build the new, and conservatism in a philosophical sense of having a healthy respect for the past and being careful about tinkering too much and changing too much. I think you could probably go wrong by leaning too much in either direction. I think we should both have a healthy respect for the past, try to make incremental change, and yet we should always be looking to the future. And occasionally we do need radical change and rewriting and overturning systems. So, I would caution anybody too much about forming too much of your philosophy or identity around either one of those things, because sometimes we need one, sometimes the other.
I have one more question that comes in from Adam Macaulay. I'm curious to hear how a new philosophy or approach to progress might address the issue of growing economic inequality nationally and internationally.
Yeah. There's a few things to say about this. So first off, in the way I think about human well-being and humanism and what we're ultimately going for, I think that absolute wealth and well-being is more important than relative. So I would rather have a system that is growing wealth and improving life for everybody, even if it was doing so unequally. And I think that is what has happened in the last few centuries. You saw one of the charts I posted was the life expectancy at birth, right? You see that even in the poorest regions of the world, life expectancy at birth is increasing. In fact, literally every country in the world today has a higher life expectancy at birth than any country did in 1800. So the worst off today are better off than the best were a few hundred years ago. And I think that's the reality of progress. It does actually get out to everybody. It is broadly distributed, even if it is not evenly or equally distributed. And I think that's a pretty good world. And I think trying to force too much equality of outcomes or distributing the benefits actually has a very active squashing effect on progress itself. So I'd rather move forward and have everybody be in a better world. That said, I do think there are important ways in which there is a lot of capture by a certain set of elites today, and so that some of that inequality is actually unfair. And I think that's something we should tamp down on. And I think this happens in First off, most obviously, maybe it's not the only place, but it clearly happens in every highly regulated industry where you end up with a lot of regulatory capture, and you end up with a few small, banking, for instance, right? You end up with a few a consolidation in a few very large players, small number of large players who are very tight with the regulators, hard for new entrants. I mean, and this goes all the way down to occupational licensing and permitting. You want to cut hair? Sorry, you're protected by the cabal of hairdressers. You have to go get your thousands of hours of instruction before you can cut somebody's hair.
Mhm.
You want to, arrange flowers? That's what you want to do for a job? Sorry, you got to get a license. You want to have a hot dog stand? License, et cetera. And these are things, this sort of protectionism keeps people out of opportunities. So I think there's a lot that we could do to lower barriers to entry and increase opportunity for everybody that would help to equal things up.
Fantastic. Well, I want to thank you, Jason Crawford from Roots of Progress, as well as all of you who are either here live or watching virtually, and those who will be watching the recording. We invited Jason to come and speak. Brilliant, by the way. Thank you for this, really, because his vision of progress matches nicely with what NELF, the New England Legal Foundation, attempts to do in pushing back against the regulated state, the regulatory state, and also against people that would want to stand in the way of progress. So his mission is our passion. And if you want to know more about the New England Legal Foundation, you can check us out at newenglandlegal.org. I want to thank you, Jason Crawford, again, and thank you all for coming. That will wrap up this latest edition of the Economic Speaker Series. Thanks all.